art can do is where kind of programs in gardening and architecture and all these things connect you with a sense of landscape and inquiry into nature, into geology, into animals, into plants and all that stuff does one thing. And art can do the things that none of those other things can do. So art does the indescribable stuff that nothing else can do. So I don't think art is there really to tell you how to bridge that role between nature and humanity. But I think what art can do is possibly make you think about those connections and the myriad connections without dictating it. I don't know where it starts, that's it. Because it's kind of a gradual thing, because I started out as a photographer and that's what I used to do. So, and I was an editorial photographer for the national papers and for the music magazines. So yeah, that's what I wanted to do and that's what I was doing. So that's kind of, where it started. And it kind of drifted away from that. I mean, I was living in Glasgow and I was doing a lot of music photography stuff, and it's not a recipe for long life in that kind of environment, shall we say. So I moved. The real starting point is that I worked for them in the music industry. There was a local music magazine that one of the clients was a local music magazine, which kind of left me free rein to do some of the things I wanted to do as well. So I looked through my record collection and from the past and found all these pop stars and went, I wonder what they're doing now. And because I had all these connections, I could find them. So I tracked them down and went out, photographed them, just a casual kind of chat and then informal portraits. And then we put an exhibition in the windows of a record shop in Glasgow. Well, we toured it in a small chain of independent record shops. And we had them as 12-inch square pictures like an album cover. The first one was in the record shop round the corner from where I lived. And the guy that sold the flowers outside one day, he said, Steve, do you know how many people are stopping to look at this exhibition? And I said, no. And he said, well, it's like all night because the lights are on at night. So people are there during the day and they're there all night. So thousands of people were seeing this exhibition. And if it was in a gallery, it's a record shop, so people are interested in music and stuff anyway. So it's that kind of audience. And that got me thinking about the power of taking art to an audience rather than waiting for an audience to come and see the art. And I think that's kind of where that started, and that was kind of where the bug bit. And I went, this is what I want to do. I want to take art and make it relevant to people and take it out to people so that people can experience it rather than putting it in a gallery where, frankly, nobody goes to galleries. Really small proportion of people go to galleries. That's kind of where it started. Long story, but there you go. That's exactly it. It's about those familiar places, and sometimes with the landscape places, it's the places that people don't really look at. So the number of clients would say, oh, you should do it in places where, in the tourist hotspots or in the places where the car parks are and people can get to. And you go, well, no, I want to do the places that people don't look at, because what that artwork does is gets people to look at places which they would normally overlook, and they can be beautiful, but you put something in it and it changes the perspective. A lot of what I do resonates with, I do these things and then you do the research and you find other people think the same thing. So that's all part of that as well, and that's something I really like as well, is that these artworks just remind you where you are. Stop and think and look. A lot of the larger pieces, when people come to them, it's the time that they spend with them as well. So you go to a gallery and you look at a sculpture, and you might be there, if you're really passionate about it, you might be there for 10-15 minutes, might you? When you're kind of looking at, Rodin's Kiss or something, you can spend 10-15 minutes. That's a long time to look at a sculpture. But when people come to see the work that I do, they can be there for 3 hours to see a piece, and that's not unusual. But by the time they've walked it around and sat and looked at it and contemplated, but then the journey to get to some of these remote places as well. And that's all that kind of slowing down. And it's not just my piece that they've come to see. They're getting to immerse themselves in that location as well. And I think that's kind of interesting, is that time that people dedicate to that as well. I mean, I know the role that art plays in that, can play in that. And I think that's, because it is a big question looking at that role between art and humanity. it is massive. And there's an awful lot to think about in that. It doesn't necessarily set an agenda, some art does, but I think, that what art can do is do it without an agenda. And I think that then becomes quite interesting, because that's kind of contemplating it, isn't it? So you wanted to know about the colour, because the colour is the thing, isn't it? Because that's it. A lot of the work that I do is in a different environment. So whether I'm working in Northern Europe or working in China, the landscape is a different colour. So it's finding a colour that works with the palette that's here, and I wanted to find a colour that works with the pastel colours of the Aegean and the dusky colours of the mountains and the rocks, and it was so a big bold bright colour just wouldn't work in that environment. And trying to find that colour, but also that kind of cultural reference point as well that you get when you find that colour and it sits right and it's not blending in, but also it doesn't feel alien as well, so that there is something kind of familiar as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to do, was something that felt familiar, and there is something familiar about that pink that's used kind of culturally as well, isn't it? And that's because of the colours of the landscape and the colour of the sea and the colour of the mountains. So they're presented down on the shore at the edge of the sea, but rather than having them just on the rocks on the edge of the sea, I wanted them to be nestled in with the architecture of the hotel. That kind of interrupted the familiar again that we talked about. So that familiar language of the hotel and the jetty and the bar and just kind of interrupting that with something almost in that surreal, not quite there, doesn't really belong, but does belong, and that kind of not fitting in and fitting in, but also the scale. And so it is an interruption. So it is an interruption that you can't miss. But that's kind of what I wanted to do, in a way, that surreal way as well, that suggests things, but nothing in particular. And that's always the most difficult thing with the work that I do is, like an abstract painting, is the trick is the difficult bit is to make it so that it doesn't have an interpretation. So, I don't want there to be a fixed interpretation. There are interpretations that I have, and I'm quite happy for other people to have their own interpretations. And I think that I like that, and I think that's kind of interesting when you just kind of leave it up to people, so they, it's not supposed to try to be something, it just is. The thing that inspires me on that is, multiple thousand-year-old tradition from Chinese art, where they would put a man-made object in a landscape so they could make sense of that landscape. And then you remember it, and it's that whole idea of putting something in a place. It causes you to look and assess the scale and the colour, but also appreciate where you are in the world as well. There's this lovely Chinese way of looking at our role on this planet, is that, as a human, we are really small and these places are really big. And it's good to kind of remind ourselves of that as well.